The ballroom at the Meridian Grand had been designed by someone who believed that excess, when executed with enough precision, became elegance. Chandeliers descended from the 40-foot ceiling like frozen waterfalls, each one a cascade of hand-cut Austrian crystal that fractured the light into 1,000 small suns. The tables were dressed in ivory linen, anchored by centerpieces of white peonies and gilded branches that cost more per arrangement than most families spent on groceries in a month. Somewhere near the east wing, a string quartet played Debussy with the kind of studied restraint that suggested the musicians had been briefed not to be too interesting. It was the annual Whitmore Foundation Gala, the kind of event that attracted people who attended charity events not because they cared about charity, but because being seen caring was its own currency. Vivienne Hartwell arrived at 7:42 p.m., 18 minutes later than the invitation specified, because she had learned long ago that punctuality was for people who needed to impress others. She wore a black column dress, no jewelry except for a single thin bracelet of white gold on her left wrist, and her dark hair pulled back with the kind of severity that looked effortless because it had taken 40 minutes to achieve. She was 36 years old, the founder and CEO of Hartwell Capital, and the third largest individual donor to the Whitmore Foundation, which meant that even the people who disliked her made sure to smile when she entered the room. She moved through the space with the practiced ease of someone who had spent 15 years learning how to be comfortable in rooms like this. She shook hands. She nodded at names she recognized. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray without looking at the person who carried it. The person carrying it was named Caleb Merritt. He was 34, though he looked older in the way that certain kinds of tiredness age. A person, not the tiredness of laziness, but the tiredness of someone who has been holding something heavy for a very long time and has gotten so good at it that strangers can no longer tell the weight is there. He was tall, with the kind of build that suggested he'd once been athletic and now simply worked hard physically. His dark uniform was pressed. His movements were quiet and efficient. He had the stillness of a person who had learned that invisibility was sometimes a skill. He didn't watch Vivienne Hartwell as she moved away. He simply moved on to the next cluster of guests, offering the tray with the same unhurried economy he had maintained for the past 2 hours. By 9 o'clock, the room had settled into its predictable rhythms. The speeches had concluded. The auction paddles had been raised and lowered. The string quartet had transitioned to something more festive. Small groups clustered around the edges of the floor, the old money near the bar, the new money near the exit, always positioned for a fast departure, and the aspirational money scattered everywhere else, orbiting. Vivienne stood near the tall windows with 3 women she knew from various boardrooms and boardroom-adjacent spaces. Diana Cole, who ran a family real estate trust. Portia Ellison, a venture partner at a firm that mostly funded other men's ideas, and Margot Graves, who had divorced extremely well twice and now spent her time on philanthropy and considered opinions. They were discussing, in the oblique way of women who had all been burned enough times to speak in near parables, the subject of men. Specifically, the men in their lives who had once been promising and had then become, in various ways, disappointing. He was charming, obviously, Portia was saying about someone. They always are. At the beginning. The beginning is the part they rehearsed, Diana said. Vivienne hadn't contributed to the conversation yet. She was watching the room, her champagne raised to her lips, but barely sipped, when she finally spoke. It was with the calm authority of someone delivering a conclusion they had arrived at years ago, and no longer felt the need to defend. Men are all the same, she said. They want what you have until they have access to it. Then they want the next thing. She paused. Every single one. The 3 women absorbed this. Margot made a small sound of agreement. Portia looked into her glass. Diana nodded slowly. The nod of someone who is not certain they agree, but is certain they don't want to argue. No one said anything to the contrary. No one except, "That hasn't been my experience." The voice came from slightly to their left and slightly behind. Low, unhurried. Not combative, simply a statement of fact, offered with the same casualness one might use to mention the weather. All 4 women turned. Caleb Merritt was standing 3 feet away with an empty tray held against his side. He had apparently finished a round of the room and was passing behind them toward the service corridor when the words had simply come out of him. His expression was neutral. He did not look embarrassed. He did not look like he regretted speaking. He looked, if anything, slightly surprised at himself, like a man who had resolved not to say something and then said it anyway, and was now quietly accepting the consequences. The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. In that ballroom, with its perfected surfaces and curated noise, 4 seconds of silence is a very long time. Vivian Hartwell looked at him. Her expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted a small recalibration, almost imperceptible. She was very good at reading people. She could not, in this moment, read him. "Excuse me?" she said. He met her gaze. "I said that hasn't been my experience." "Men." He paused. "Not all of them. And your experience qualifies you to speak on the subject," she said. Not a question. A wall. Built fast and smooth. "My experience qualifies me to speak on my own life," he said. "Same as yours qualifies you to speak on yours." Then he nodded once, a small, clean gesture, neither deferential nor defiant, and continued toward the service corridor. Vivienne watched him go. Portia made a quiet noise. Margot said, "Well." Vivienne said nothing. She took a sip of her champagne. The string quartet switched to something she didn't recognize. The room resumed its careful noise, but the 4 seconds of silence had left something behind. A small, unwanted splinter of a question she didn't have an answer for. She did not like questions she didn't have answers for. The documents had fallen because she'd been carrying too many things at once, which she knew, even as it happened, was a metaphor she would refuse to examine. The folder had slid from under her arm when she reached for her phone, and 37 pages of the Whitmore Foundation's Q3 development plan had fanned out across the marble floor of the hotel lobby in a slow, expensive-looking disaster. She had crouched immediately, gathering pages with efficient irritation, when a pair of hands appeared in her peripheral vision. Large hands, unhurried, gathering pages with the same efficiency, but without the irritation. She looked up. Caleb Merritt was crouching across from her, stacking pages neatly. He looked at the header of the top sheet, Whitmore Foundation, Strategic Development, and then looked at her without particular expression. "These are in order," he said, and handed the stack across. She took them. "Thank you." He stood. She stood. A beat passed, in which she was aware that she had, just moments ago, been the person on the floor scrambling, and he was the one who had been calm. "You work here?" she asked. It came out flatter than she intended, carrying, she recognized too late, a faint note of condescension, as though the question itself implied that his presence required explaining. "Tonight," he said. "Not full-time. What else do you do?" He tilted his head slightly. "This and that." He said it without apology or evasion. Simply, this and that. As though the details were his, and he had not yet decided to share them. "I didn't know you were still here," she said. "Event runs until 11. I'm here until 11. She was quiet for a moment. She was, she realized, waiting for something for him to fill the silence with something eager, something self-promotional, something that would explain him to her in a way she could file away. He didn't. He simply waited, in the way of a person who is comfortable with silence and doesn't feel obligated to end it. "You said something earlier," she said. "At the gala. Your experience. I remember. What did you mean by it?" He considered this for a moment. Not performing consideration. Actually thinking. "That the thing you said, men are all the same, it's a conclusion. And conclusions that wide usually come from pain." He paused. "I wasn't arguing with the pain, just with the conclusion." She looked at him steadily. "That's a distinction a lot of people wouldn't bother making. A lot of people wouldn't have said anything in the first place." "No," she said. "They wouldn't." Another pause. Outside the lobby's revolving doors, a car horn sounded twice. The concierge 15 feet away pretended to be occupied with something at his desk. "Why did you?" she asked. "Say something." You didn't have to." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I have a daughter. And someday someone is going to say something like that in front of her. And I want her to already know it isn't true." He said it simply, no drama, just the truth of it, stated clean. Something moved across Vivian Hartwell's face. It was brief, and she controlled it quickly. But it had been there. "I see," she said. He nodded. "Good night, Miss Hartwell." He turned and walked back in the direction of the service wing. She stood in the lobby with her documents in her hands and watched the space where he had been. The concierge continued to pretend. The revolving doors continued to turn. She had not told him her name. He had known it anyway, which meant he had recognized her at the gala and had said nothing about it. Had treated her with exactly the same matter-of-fact courtesy he would have extended to anyone, which was, she realized, rarer than it should have been. She walked to the elevator, pressed the button, waited. The questions were multiplying. The apartment on Maple Street was on the 4th floor of a building that had good bones and not enough money for anything else. The hallway smelled faintly of someone else's cooking, always different depending on the floor. And the elevator worked about 60% of the time. Caleb Merritt had lived there for 2 years and had learned to like the stairs. His daughter's name was Rosie. She was 6 years old and had her mother's eyes a precise, luminous gray that seemed to change color depending on the light, and her father's stubborn chin. She woke up most mornings before her alarm and came padding down the hall to find him in the kitchen, because she had learned early that the kitchen was where her father could be reliably located between 6 and 7 a.m., standing at the stove or the counter, moving through the quiet machinery of a morning routine. This particular morning, she found him making oatmeal and reading something on his phone with the expression he wore when the news was bad but not immediately catastrophic. "Daddy," she said, climbing onto her stool at the counter with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this approximately 2,000 times. "Good morning, Bug." He closed the app on his phone and turned to her. "Sleep okay? I had the dream about the library again." She accepted this as a neutral fact. The one where all the books talk. Was that scary? She considered. No. They were mostly arguing about which one of them was better. It was boring. He set a bowl in front of her. She examined it with the critical eye of someone evaluating an artwork they hadn't commissioned. "Did you work late?" she asked. "Until 11. That's very late." "It is. Are you tired?" He looked at her. She was looking up at him with her gray eyes. Serious. Waiting. This was the thing about Rosie: she asked questions she actually wanted. Answered, with a directness that most adults had carefully unlearned. He had decided long ago never to lie to her about the small things. "A little," he said. "Not very. Because I came home and you were here. And that fixes most things." She accepted this, appearing to find it both accurate and satisfactory. She picked up her spoon. "Daddy, do we have the thing on Saturday?" "What thing?" "The school thing. The spring fair." He had forgotten about the spring fair. He made a mental note in the part of his mind reserved for logistics, which was dense and cross-referenced and running continuously in the background at all times. Spring fair, Saturday. He had a shift at the repair shop from 9 to 1. He could ask Marcus to cover noon to 1 if he picked up Marcus's Wednesday evening slot. "Yes," he said. "We have the thing on Saturday." "Good. Sophie's mom is bringing her, and I want to show Sophie the ring toss because I'm very good at ring toss now." "You are very good at ring toss." "Better than you." "Much better than me." She smiled and bent over her oatmeal, satisfied. He turned back to the counter, refilling his coffee, looking out the window at the Maple Street morning, the dry cleaner pulling up his gate, the orange cat that lived 3 buildings down posted at his usual station on the fire escape, 2 kids on bikes, moving against the traffic in the cheerful, illegal way of children who have not yet learned that rules apply to them. This was his life. These were its dimensions. On most days, he did not find them lacking. On some days, they were the only thing he had. He thought, briefly, about the woman in the lobby. Her expression when he'd mentioned Rosie. Something had moved across her face. Something she hadn't intended. Hadn't controlled in time. He had filed it away without meaning to. He finished his coffee, rinsed the cup, and went to find Rosie's missing left shoe, which turned out to be under the radiator in the hall, which was where it always ended up. Some things were predictable. He was grateful for those. The Whitmore Foundation ran an after-school enrichment program in 3 locations across the city, and Vivienne Hartwell was on the foundation's steering committee, which meant that twice a year she was expected to appear at one of the sites for an assessment visit that justified her position on the committee and generated the photographs used in the annual report. She had arranged to visit the Clover Street site on a Wednesday afternoon in late April, accompanied by her assistant, Nadia, and the foundation's program director, a warm and perpetually harried woman named Sandra Cho. The visit was scheduled for 90 minutes. Vivienne had allocated exactly 90 minutes in her calendar, blocked with the same precision she applied to everything. The Clover Street Center occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse, and it was, she had to admit, well run. The rooms were bright. The children were loud in the productive way of children who are engaged rather than simply contained. Sandra walked her through the robotics station, the reading corners, the art tables covered in projects in various states of cheerful chaos. In the small woodworking room at the back, an addition that the program had introduced 6 months ago, apparently funded by a local business partnership, 3 children were working with a volunteer instructor on a birdhouse project. The instructor was crouched beside a workbench, guiding a small girl's hands on a handsaw, with the specific patience of someone who has learned to slow down without making the slowness feel like condescension. Vivienne stopped in the doorway. The instructor looked up. Caleb Merritt looked as unsurprised to see her as he had looked the first time, which was to say, mildly surprised, but not distressed about it. He stood from his crouch. "Miss Hartwell." Mr. She paused. She didn't know his last name. "Merritt," he said. "Caleb Merritt. You volunteer here. Wednesday afternoons. I do some woodworking. The kids seem to like it." He glanced at the 3 children, who had paused their work to evaluate the visitors with the frank appraisal of the young. "Rosie, come say hello." The small girl at the workbench, gray eyes, stubborn chin, wood shavings on her sleeve, looked up. "Hi," she said to Vivienne, with the directness of someone who had not yet learned to be nervous about people. "Hi," Vivienne said. And then, because the child was looking at her with apparent interest, and the only honest response to genuine interest is engagement. "What are you making?" "A birdhouse," Rosie said. "It's for a bluebird." Daddy looked up the exact right size for the hole. Bluebirds are specific about the hole size. She said this with the gravity of someone sharing classified information. "Are they 1.5 inches?" "Exactly. Otherwise, other birds try to move in, and then there's conflict." She returned to her work with the authority of someone who has said what needs to be said. Vivienne looked at Caleb. Something in her expression was off balance, in a way she didn't try to hide, which was new. "She's yours," Vivienne said. "She is. She's remarkable. I know." He said it without false modesty or performative pride. Simply, "Yes, she is. I know this." Sandra was saying something behind Vivienne about the program's outcomes data. Nadia was making notes. The ordinary machinery of the visit was continuing, but Vivienne stood in the doorway of the woodworking room for a moment longer than her 90-minute schedule technically allowed, watching a 6-year-old measure a birdhouse hole with a precision that suggested she had inherited someone's uncompromising attention to detail. She thought about what Caleb had said in the lobby. "I have a daughter. And someday, someone is going to say something like that in front of her." She thought, "This is that daughter." She thought, "This is what that sentence meant." Vivienne Hartwell had built her company on the principle that sentiment was a vulnerability. Not because she was cold, she was aware that people who met her often concluded this, but because she had learned, at some cost, that the things she had allowed herself to feel most quickly had also been the things that had been used against her most efficiently. The lesson had not been delivered gently. She had been 28, just starting to build what would become Hartwell Capital, and she had trusted someone, a partner, a colleague, a man who had known exactly which version of her to present to inspire that trust, and he had taken information and contacts and time and eventually a significant sum of money and had left her standing in the wreckage of what should have been her first major fundraise, holding nothing but documentation of her own naivety. She had rebuilt. Of course she had. The story of Hartwell Capital was, in part, a story about what Vivian Hartwell could do when she had no other options and too much to prove. But the rebuilding had required a reorganization of certain internal architecture. Certain doors had been closed. Certain questions, the ones that led somewhere soft, had been stopped before they became habits. She was efficient. She was effective. She was, by any measurable standard, successful. And she had made a private peace with what that efficiency had cost. Caleb Merritt was, she recognized with the clinical part of her mind, a problem. Not because he had done anything. He had done essentially nothing. He had spoken once at a gala, been calm in a lobby, and spent a Wednesday afternoon teaching children to measure birdhouse holes. None of these things were dramatic. None of them should have required any significant portion of her attention. And yet she had found herself, on 3 separate occasions in the 2 weeks since the Clover Street visit, thinking about something he had said, about the fact that she couldn't file him in any of the categories she used. About the child with the gray eyes. She was not, she told herself, interested. She was curious. Curiosity was different. Curiosity was just information gathering. She was in the business of information. She called Sandra Cho and asked, in the most professionally framed way possible, whether the volunteer at the Clover Street woodworking station had been properly vetted. Sandra said yes, absolutely. Caleb Merritt had been through the full background process. Sandra also said, because Sandra was the kind of warm and perceptive person who could hear things in questions that the person asking hadn't intended to include. He's quite extraordinary, honestly. He had a different life before. He doesn't really talk about it. But he shows up every Wednesday without fail, rain or shine, and those kids love him. Before what? Vivian asked. I probably shouldn't say. It's his story to tell. Sandra paused. But you should ask him yourself. I think he'd answer. Vivian thanked her and ended the call. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on her desk, looking at nothing in particular. She did not like being told to ask someone something directly. It meant relinquishing the advantage of knowing before you asked. It meant the conversation could go anywhere. She picked up her phone, set it down, picked it up again. She typed a message to Nadia. Can you get me the contact information for the volunteer woodworking instructor at Clover Street? Foundation liaison purposes. The phrase foundation liaison purposes was, she acknowledged privately, doing a great deal of work in that sentence. The spring fair at Rosie's school was the kind of event that deployed primary colors aggressively and smelled of popcorn and sunscreen and the particular sugar of fried dough. Caleb arrived with Rosie at 10:15, having rearranged his Saturday to get here, having arranged coverage for his repair shop shift, having packed a bag that contained, among other things, 2 Band-Aids, preemptive, a juice box, a change of socks. Rosie had opinions about wet socks and a $20 bill that he had decided was the fair's entire budget for games and treats, non-negotiable. Rosie immediately located Sophie and Sophie's mother and was absorbed into that social unit with the efficiency of a child who knows where she belongs. Caleb stood at a slight remove from the parent cluster that had formed at the ring toss station, watching Rosie demonstrate her technique to Sophie with the seriousness of an athlete coaching a recruit. He had not slept especially well. He'd taken on an extra evening shift 3 times this week to cover a gap in the repair shop's schedule, and the fatigue had settled into a specific zone behind his eyes that he'd learned to work through. He stood in the morning sun and watched his daughter, and felt the tiredness and the other thing, the particular, fierce gratitude that sat underneath the tiredness and sometimes felt indistinguishable from it. He became aware, at some point, that a woman he didn't recognize was watching him, middle-aged, lanyard from the parent volunteer committee, the expression of someone who had made a decision and was about to act on it. She moved toward him with the specific trajectory of someone who has spotted a problem to solve. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Rosie Merritt's father?" "Yes, I'm Carol Bancroft. I'm one of the room parents." She had the quality of someone who believed room parents were a position that required announcing. "I wanted to speak with you about Rosie." He turned to face her fully. "Is she okay?" "She's fine. She's fine. It's just," Carol Bancroft adjusted her lanyard. We've noticed that Rosie can be somewhat assertive with the other children. About the right way to do things. It can be a little. She made a gesture that suggested she was searching for a word that would be honest without being unkind, and was not finding one. Bossy, Caleb said. Well, she seemed relieved not to have to say it. She is very confident. Which is wonderful. But some of the other children find it a little. I appreciate you raising it. His voice was still calm. It had not changed register. But there was something in the quality of the attention he brought to bear on Carol Bancroft that was not quite warm. Can I ask, has Rosie done anything unkind? Has she hurt anyone or excluded anyone? No, nothing like that. She just, has she been wrong about the things she's been assertive about? Carol Bancroft blinked. No. She tends to be quite accurate. Okay. He nodded, slowly. I'll talk to her about how to share what she knows in a way that feels collaborative rather than directive. That's a good skill to learn. He paused, but I won't ask her to be less confident. She'll need it. There was a silence. Carol Bancroft seemed to be recalibrating. That seems fair, she said finally. He turned back to watch Rosie, who had just landed 3 rings in a row and was not being especially modest about it. She's quite something, said a voice to his left. He turned. Vivienne Hartwell was standing 6 feet away, wearing dark jeans and a simple gray jacket, and the expression of someone who had been watching a scene play out and had, perhaps, enjoyed it more than they'd expected to. She looked different out of gala clothes, more angular, more present, somehow more herself. He admitted, surprised. What are you doing here? Sandra Cho mentioned the spring fair. I have a committee meeting at a school 2 blocks away. She paused. I may have arrived 20 minutes early. For the committee meeting? Yes. He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them believed the explanation entirely, which both of them knew, and neither of them mentioned. You handled that well, she said, nodding slightly toward where Carol Bancroft had retreated. She meant well. Most people who say damaging things do. She said it flatly, without heat. That doesn't make them less damaging. He was quiet for a moment. No, it doesn't. He looked at her. You sound like you know that. From a specific place. I know it from several specific places. Rosie appeared at his elbow without warning, as she often did, a quality she shared with cats. Daddy, I got 5 in a row. Sophie only got 2, but she's improving. She noticed Vivienne. Oh, you're the lady from the woodworking room. I am, Vivienne said. Is your name still the same? Vivienne. Vivienne said. Yes. I finished the birdhouse, Rosie announced. Dad put it up on the fire escape. No bluebirds yet, but it's only been a week, and Dad says birds are methodical. They are, Vivienne agreed. Are you methodical? Rosie asked. Something moved across Vivienne's face, the beginning of an expression she didn't quite suppress. Very, she said. So is Dad, Rosie said, with the air of someone drawing a satisfying connection. Then she spotted something across the fairground and was gone. Caleb watched her go. Then he looked at Vivienne Hartwell, who was watching the space where Rosie had been with the expression of someone receiving information that is reorganizing something internal. She asked if you were methodical, he said. She did. She asks everyone that lately. Because of the bird thing. He paused. She's trying to figure out which people are like the birds, worth waiting for. Vivienne was quiet for a moment. And, what's your conclusion? I don't usually conclude quickly, he said. Rosie gets that from me. The morning sun was warm on the school's little field. Somewhere near the dunk tank, a child was shrieking with the pure joy of something working exactly as intended. He stood next to this complicated, careful woman in the ordinary brightness of a Saturday morning and found that he was, for the first time in a long time, curious about another person's story. He did not say this. He simply stood and let the morning continue. The research took her 20 minutes. She hadn't meant to do it. She had opened her laptop to look at something else entirely, and then she had typed his name, and then she had followed one result to another the way you follow a path without meaning to walk very far. Caleb Merritt had graduated from Columbia's School of Engineering 14 years ago with honors. He had worked at Meridian Tech as a systems architect for 6 years, rising to senior lead before 30. He had been, and here she slowed, reading carefully part of the team that built the infrastructure underlying 2 significant cloud products that were now used by millions. His name appeared in 2 industry journal articles and 1 conference presentation from about 5 years back. And then, nothing. His professional footprint ended approximately 4 years ago, as though the person she was reading about had simply stopped. She sat back in her chair. She searched differently. She searched the way you search when you're looking for the part of a story someone hasn't told you. She found, eventually, a brief notice in a local community newsletter, the kind of publication that reported on neighborhood events, and, occasionally, small tragedies noting that Elena Merritt, 31, had died after a sudden illness. She was survived by her husband and infant daughter. The notice was 4 years and 3 months old. Vivienne sat very still for a long moment. She thought about the hotel lobby. His voice. Not all stories end the same. She thought about what he had given up, or rather, what he had reorganized his entire existence around without, apparently, requiring anyone to know about it. Without, as far as she could tell, making it the central fact of his identity or using it as a credential. She thought about the way he had said, "I have a daughter." And someday someone is going to say something like that in front of her. And I want her to already know it isn't true. He had said it as an explanation for speaking up in a room full of strangers. But it was also, she understood now, a statement about what he was doing with his entire life. Every extra shift, every Wednesday afternoon in the woodworking room, every repacked bag with preemptive band-aids. It was all oriented toward the same thing. Toward Rosie, toward making sure Rosie grew up in the fullest possible version of the world, even when the world had taken something essential from her father. Vivienne closed her laptop. She thought about her own version of loss, different in kind, but not entirely in quality. She thought about what she had built in response to hers, and what it had required her to foreclose. She thought about the words she had used at the gala, all. Men are all the same. The absolute of it. The safety of it. The conclusion that wide, he had said, usually comes from pain. She picked up her phone. She had his number via Sandra, via the pretense of Foundation liaison purposes. She had not used it yet, because using it would mean something she hadn't decided she was prepared for. She typed, "This is Vivienne Hartwell. I owe you something close to an apology. If you're willing to hear it over coffee, I'd be grateful." She read it over twice, deleted close to, sent it. She set the phone face down on her desk and did not look at it for 17 minutes, which was, for her, a significant exercise in restraint. When she finally turned it over, his reply was brief and unhurried, in the way all his communications apparently were. "Saturday's work. There's a place on Clement that's good. 9 a.m. If that's not too early." It was not too early. She was always up by 6. She typed, "See you then," and then she sat for a moment with the particular feeling of a door she had believed permanently closed, showing, in the light of a specific afternoon, the fine outline of a handle. The call came on a Thursday evening at 8:47 p.m. when Vivienne was in the back of a car heading to a dinner she had not wanted to attend. And the number on her screen was Diane Cho. Not Sandra, Diane, her CFO, which meant it was bad. It was, in fact, quite bad. A former Hartwell Capital analyst, terminated 8 months ago for cause, had provided materials to a financial journalist suggesting that the firm had misrepresented performance metrics in 2 client reports. The materials were selectively edited and largely misleading, which Diane confirmed within the first 60 seconds of the call, but selectively edited and largely misleading was a qualification that did not prevent the story from existing or from being published in the morning on a platform that reached the kind of people whose opinion of Vivienne Hartwell's firm had direct financial consequences. By the time she arrived at her office, she had turned the car around. Her legal team was already assembled. By 10 o'clock, they had a documented rebuttal. By 11, they had contacted the journalist with a formal response and a request for the story to be held pending verification. The journalist, it emerged, was not interested in holding the story. By midnight, Vivienne's office contained 4 lawyers, 2 communications consultants, Diane, and a specific exhaustion that was not about tiredness, but about the particular weight of being attacked by someone who had taken something true about you. The records, the numbers, and the performance, and arranged it in the wrong order, and called the arrangement evidence. At 12:40 a.m., there was a knock at the office's outer door. Nadia, who was still there because Nadia was always still there in crises, answered it. There was a brief, low exchange. Then Nadia came to the doorway of the conference room, where Vivienne was sitting with the lawyers, and said, "There's a Caleb Merritt here. He says you know him. He says he has something that might be useful." Everyone looked at Vivienne. She was, for approximately 2 seconds, completely still. Then she said, "Send him in." He came in with a battered laptop bag over one shoulder, and the expression of someone who has solved a problem on the way over, and is carrying the solution carefully so it doesn't spill. He looked at the room lawyers, consultants, the late-night wreckage of a crisis in progress, and did not look alarmed or overwhelmed. "How did you know?" Vivienne said. "Diane called Sandra. Sandra called me. I used to work in systems architecture." He put his bag on the table. "Before. I know how performance metrics get recorded on the back end. If the analyst pulled those reports from the system directly, there will be timestamps and metadata showing the export sequence." He opened the laptop. "If he edited the output files after export, the metadata won't match. That's provable. And if I can access your original data repository..." One of the lawyers started to object about access protocols. Vivienne said, quietly, "Give him access." It took Caleb 45 minutes. The room was mostly quiet while he worked, the kind of quiet that comes from people watching someone do something they don't fully understand, but can recognize as being done with mastery. His hands moved with a certainty that was not the certainty of performance, but of actual knowledge, the specific confidence of someone who spent years building the exact kind of system he was now navigating. At 1:37 a.m., he looked up from the laptop. "The analyst exported the raw data on March 14th at 11:42 p.m., he said. "The files the journalist received were last modified on March 19th at 3:18 a.m., 5 days and about 100 specific alterations later." He turned the screen toward the lawyers. "The original exports are still in your archival backup. The differential is documented in the system's own log." He paused. "You don't have a crisis. You have evidence of the person who manufactured one." The silence in the room changed quality. One of the lawyers said, very quietly, "My God." Vivienne was looking at Caleb. He was looking at the screen, checking something, making sure. "Why?" she said. He looked up. The room was very quiet. "Why did you come?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because someone should stay. When things fall apart." It was the simplest sentence. It contained no self-consciousness, no bid for credit, no upward inflection asking to be acknowledged. It was just the truth of what he believed, stated with the plainness of a person who had been living by it for long enough that the stating was easy. The room was very still. The lawyers were looking at their notes. Diane had her hand over her mouth. Nadia was standing in the doorway with her arms folded, and an expression that was difficult to interpret. Vivienne Hartwell, who had been looking at Caleb Merritt with an expression she was no longer attempting to control, said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you." He nodded once. Closed his laptop. "I'll send you the documented file path. Your team can take it from here." He stood, put his bag over his shoulder. "You should try to sleep a few hours if you can." "I will." He moved toward the door, stopped, turned slightly. "The coffee Saturday. Still on?" She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "Still on." He nodded. Left. In the room, one of the lawyers exhaled. Diane looked at Vivienne. Vivienne looked at the space where Caleb had been. "Who is he?" Diane said. "I'm figuring that out," Vivienne said. Number. Part 9. The smaller things. The cafe on Clement was small and warm and smelled of good coffee and something baking. Caleb was already there when she arrived, which she was aware said something she was going to have to sit with. He had a coffee in front of him and a second cup on the opposite side of the table, which said something else. She sat down, wrapped her hands around the cup, looked at him across the small table. "Thank you," she said. "For Thursday night." "Already said." "I know. I'm saying it again." He nodded, accepting this without deflecting it. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I looked you up. Before Thursday. I know about your wife." He was still, not the stillness of a person caught, but the stillness of a person who has learned to hold difficult things without flinching. "Okay," he said. "I'm sorry. For your loss." She said it without the usual social gloss, without the protective coating of formality. Just directly. "Thank you," he said it the same way. "You gave up the career. I reorganized it." He corrected this gently. "I still work in tech, occasionally. Consult. The rest of the time I do things with more flexible hours." He paused. "It's not what I designed my life to be." But Rosie needed someone present, not someone successful and mostly absent. He looked at his coffee. "Easy choice. Once I actually made it." "Was it easy?" He looked up. "No. Saying it out loud makes it clean. Living it was messier." He paused. "There are weeks I'm tired in a way I don't have words for. There are things I've put down that I haven't fully made my peace with. But," he shrugged. And it was a genuine shrug, not dismissive, but honest. "She's 6, and she knows the exact right size of a bluebird's preferred entry hole." So, Vivienne looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "At the gala, I was wrong." He waited, not wrong to have the experience I had, but wrong to make it universal. She said this with the precision of someone who has thought about the difference and decided it matters. "I've been using one person's failure as evidence for an entire category. It's not rigorous." She almost smiled on the last word. The almost smile was complicated and real. "It's human," he said. "I'm usually better at distinguishing between data and narrative. People usually aren't. When it hurts, I mean." She was quiet. Outside the cafe window, Clement Street was doing its Saturday morning business, the farmer's market 2 blocks over, pulling foot traffic past, a woman with a stroller and a coffee, a terrier investigating a lamppost with academic intensity. "I've been alone for 8 years, she said. It came out with less effort than she'd expected. I told myself that was a choice. A professional optimization. Sentiment as liability. She looked at her coffee. Some of it was true. Some of it was just easier than admitting I was afraid. Of what? Of being wrong about someone again. She looked up. Of trusting the version someone presents and missing the person underneath. She paused. I'm very good at surfaces. Less good at what's underneath. And I've learned at cost what happens when you get the two confused. He was quiet, listening with the quality of attention that was his specific characteristic, not passive, not waiting for his turn, but actually present. I don't think you're dangerous, she said. That's not a compliment, exactly. It's the thing I keep arriving at, which is unusual. I have good threat detection. I'm not a threat, he said. I'm also not especially available for a relationship that runs on a schedule between mergers and acquisitions. She raised an eyebrow at him. I wasn't proposing a relationship. I know. He smiled. And the smile was the first genuinely unguarded thing she had seen from him. Not managed, not deployed. Just present. I was proposing honesty. About what this is and what it might be. She considered this. That's unexpectedly direct. I have a 6-year-old, he said. I've had to become direct. She asks me questions I don't have answers to, and I've learned it's better to say so than to perform certainty. What questions? Whether her mom would have liked her birdhouse. He said it quietly, without flinching. Whether I miss her. What missing someone means when you can't remember them. Vivienne was very still. What do you say? She asked. I say yes, and yes. And that missing someone means they mattered. And that's not sad. It's true. He paused, and then she usually says okay and goes back to whatever she was doing. Because she's 6, and she has the attention span of someone who gets enough love to not have to worry for long. Vivian looked out the window. The terrier had concluded his investigation and moved on. The farmer's market was getting louder. She's going to be extraordinary, she said. She already is. He said it matter-of-factly, the same way he said everything. She's just also going to be extraordinary later. In different ways. They sat in the cafe for a long time. They talked about the foundation and the woodworking room and the crisis and what Caleb had been building professionally before and what he was thinking about now. They talked in the careful, feeling-out way of two people who are both good at listening and are both slightly surprised to have found someone else who is. She did not perform. He did not perform. That was, she realized, the most unexpectedly valuable thing. It was a Sunday evening in early June, and the fire escape outside Caleb's apartment had become, with some rearrangement of potted plants and a folding chair, a serviceable small outdoor space. The birdhouse was mounted on the railing. No bluebirds yet, but 2 sparrows had been conducting what appeared to be exploratory surveys. Rosie was inside, asleep, having declared herself absolutely not tired at 7:30 p.m. and been asleep by 7:45. Vivian was in the folding chair with her legs folded under her, which was not how she usually sat but had turned out to be the position that fit the chair and the evening. Caleb was leaning against the railing with a beer he'd mostly forgotten about. The city below them was doing its evening things. The orange cat was on his fire escape, 3 buildings over, monitoring his territory with the practiced surveillance of the very comfortable. They had been talking for 2 hours, the way they had learned to talk over the past 6 weeks, without the social scaffolding of mutual performance, without the implication that either of them needed to present a particular version of themselves. It was an unusual register for Vivienne. She was learning to exist in it. I called Diana today, she said. She said the former analyst is cooperating with the legal process. Apparently, the journalist is not pleased. No journalist likes to find out they carried a fabricated story. He should have verified more carefully. He probably wanted the story to be true. She thought about this. That's more generous than I'd be. I'm not being generous. I'm being accurate. He turned the beer in his hand. People don't usually fabricate things because they're malicious. They fabricate them because they want a particular world to be real, and they're willing to help it along. He paused. Still wrong, but understandable. She looked at him. You do that a lot. What? Separate the person from the action. Judge the action without condemning the person entirely. I have a daughter who is learning how to be a person, he said. She makes mistakes constantly. If I conflated her actions with her character every time, she'd think she was a bad person by noon most days. He shrugged. You extend that to most people once you practice it enough. It requires a lot of grace. It requires a decision, he said. Grace sounds like something you either have or you don't. It's more like a practice. You decide you're going to do it, and then you do it badly for a while until you get better. She was quiet for a moment. Below, a group of people passed on the sidewalk, their voices lifting briefly before fading. I've been thinking about what I said at the gala, she said. The thing I said. Men are all the same. Yes. She paused. I think I was building a wall. And I called the wall a conclusion, because conclusions sound like wisdom, and walls sound like fear. He didn't say anything. Let the sentence stand. I've been afraid for 8 years, she said. And I've been very good at making the fear look like discernment. She looked out at the city. That's maybe the most dangerous kind of fear. The kind that wears a smart outfit. He almost smiled. She heard it in his silence. I was wrong, she said. About the conclusion. Maybe not. Not entirely wrong about the men in my specific history. But about the category. She paused. I was wrong about the category. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the thing about categories is they're shortcuts. They're useful when you need to move fast through a lot of information, but they don't survive contact with individuals. He paused. Once you actually meet someone, you have to throw the shortcut away and start over. That's frightening. It is. Every time. Every time. He agreed. That's the part they don't tell you. That being open to people doesn't get easier, exactly. You just get better at tolerating the fear while you're doing it. She looked at him for a long moment. The evening had settled into the specific blue-gray of a June dusk, and the city lights were beginning to do their thing, and on the railing of Caleb Merritt's fourth-floor fire escape, the birdhouse sat patient in its careful dimensions, 1.5 inches exactly, waiting with the unhurried confidence of something built for the right purpose. Not all stories end the same, she said. It was the thing he had said to her the first time, at the gala, and she was saying it back now not as a question but as a thing she was trying on, testing its weight, finding it real. He looked at her, and for the first time she could see clearly what had been underneath the neutrality all along, not guardedness but patience. The specific patience of someone who had decided to believe in good things slowly, to let them prove themselves, rather than demanding proof up front. No, he said. They don't. The orange cat across the way stretched elaborately and resettled. The city hummed its ordinary Friday, turning into evening sound. Rosie slept her dreamless 6-year-old sleep inside, untroubled, loved. Vivian Hartwell sat on a fire escape in a folding chair and let herself be, for the first time in a long time, uncertain about the next chapter. Not afraid of the uncertainty, just present in it. It turned out that being present was enough. It turned out that was, in fact, the whole thing. The sparrows would come back to the birdhouse, or they wouldn't. The bluebirds would find it, or they wouldn't. The world would deliver what it delivered. And Caleb Merritt, who had learned this the hardest possible way, sat on his fire escape and understood as he had understood for 4 years, through the exhaustion and the rearranging and the preemptive band-aids, that showing up was the whole argument. Not grand, not eloquent, not perfect, just present, reliably, stubbornly, quietly present, which, as it turned out, was everything.